slicing up kiwi fruits and sticking it on top of a chicken and serving tiny portions of undercooked vegetables and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of bad Nouvelle cuisine that happened in the late 1970s, and that led to an enormous backlash.
Greetings, and welcome to Books About Food, the podcast. I'm James Freefort, and that was Luke Barr discussing his new book, The Secret History of French Cooking, the outlaw chefs who made food modern. So what exactly is the secret history? He'll tell us on this episode of Books About Food, the podcast. Thanks for joining. Well, let me start off with a question. One question, but it has two different angles. The first question relates to you. Why France? What is your interest in France?
Obviously, I love France. What a wonderful place to go. I go there quite frequently. Not every summer, but So the answer is, I think the answer is it's pretty much, it happened accidentally. I grew up hearing about France from my family. My dad, when he was a kid, he and his two brothers had traveled to France and to Switzerland multiple times. This is in the 1950s with my grandmother and her sister MFK Fisher. MFK Fisher was the great American food writer, and so they did these wonderful trips on a boat from California through the Panama Canal over to Europe, and then they would spend a year or this happened twice. I'm not going to remember the exact dates, but they spent a year in the south of France, or half the year in the south of France, and the other half of the year in the French part of Switzerland. So I grew up hearing about these stories, and and in fact, my first book sort of came out of those stories that I heard from my family. My first book was Provence, 1970, and it was about my great aunt MFK Fisher and James Beard and Julia Child all in the south of France together. And that book came about because I wrote an article for Travel and Leisure that was sort of about me going to France and tracing the sort of family history there about MFK Fisher and my grandmother together with Julia Child, etc. So that's a long-winded way of saying that France is sort of part of my family history, and also that it accidentally turned into the subject of my first book. So that's why France.
Okay, well, I have to say that Provence 1970 is a wonderful book. Figured I'd get that out there. That's a personal suggestion. As I really enjoyed reading that. So the second part of that same question is, why France? How did it become so popular culinarily? Because it's surrounded by other countries with great culinary histories, but what is it about France, or maybe it's the people, that somehow push themselves to the forefront of gastronomy?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I really can give the authoritative answer on that, because I'm not truly a food historian per se. But it certainly is the case that French, the whole idea of haute cuisine, of a codified system of cooking, comes from France, right? So in the 19th century, you've got Carême and these other great chefs who are presenting, and then Escoffier, who was the subject of my second book, in the late 19th century, kind of codifying, the French mother sauces, and this is the style of this is what haute cuisine is. This is the division of labor inside of a kitchen, and like I said, I am familiar with one sliver of that story because of the book I wrote about Ritz and Escoffier, which is to say these two working class, one French, one Swiss guys who came up in the world of hotels and restaurants, and then went to London in the 1890s and opened the Savoy Hotel, which was this very glamorous modern luxury hotel in London, the first building in London with an elevator, et cetera, and a very, and put the idea of the restaurant, the sort of luxury restaurant, at the forefront, with Escoffier as this chef, the sort of first celebrity chef in a way. And Escoffier was key in creating a kind of systematized kitchen where you had a division of labor among the different departments inside the kitchen, and where the kitchen was less chaotic than it had been previously. And then once they got scandalously fired from / quit from the Savoy and moved to Paris, he had time to then write his his famous cookbook, where he codified French cooking. This is in the early, late 19th, early 20th century, right around the turn of the century. And he decided he wanted to create a cookbook which would start with us, learning how to make a stock, a chicken stock, a veal stock, and then from there to the sauces, and from there to the basic preparations, all the way up to his famous peach melba dessert. So he kind of codified French cooking, and then for the rest of the 20th century, French food was haute cuisine. A fancy restaurant in New York in the 1950s and 60s was a French restaurant. And French food kind of dominated the world in that way. Not that they had the best food, and no one's going to say that Italian food isn't as good as French food, but that it had taken the world as the sort of the definition of what is a great restaurant. And in fact, that's what the characters in my new book in the 1970s are rebelling against. They're rebelling against this idea that they have to keep cooking these classic, famous, dishes.
Well, actually, maybe I should ask, your book covers roughly, I guess, the 50s to the early 80s, I believe, give or take.
Yeah, I mean, there's scenes from the 50s. Basically, though, I sort of start the story in the mid late 60s, which is when this new generation of French chefs are sort of coming of age. Michel Guérard opens Le Pot au Feu on the outskirts of Paris in 1966, I think. And in the early 1970s is when Go and Millau kind of champion this idea of a nouvelle cuisine. And the heyday of nouvelle cuisine and this new style of cooking is in the mid to late 70s, and then it sort of peters out in the early 80s. So that's the time frame. I would say late 60s to early 80s.
So we're talking about Nouvelle, but it's interesting because Nouvelle is pretty much non-existent now, but in some ways it was the second coming of French cooking.
Right. Well, I mean, to me, when I started working on this book, I thought nobody knows what nouvelle. I mean, if you ask somebody today what is nouvelle cuisine, no one's even heard of it, or if they have heard of it, they think of it as something kind of silly. It was a fad from the 70s. It was sort of preposterous. But in fact, I think the argument I'm making in the book is that so much of our current food culture comes from this 1970s period. This is the origin of so much of what we just take for granted. We take it for granted that, to start with the food, that a chef might invent a new dish. Now, we were talking earlier about Escoffier and haute cuisine and the sort of traditional French cooking and the Espagnole sauces and the duck à l'orange and all the kind of classic dishes that every French restaurant has on its menu. And by the time we have now in the late 1960s, this kind of new generation of chefs, Paul Bocuse, Michel Guérard, the Trois Gras brothers, Roger Verger, etc., who are now kind of iconic, but for them, they were of this new generation, post 1968, whatever, sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the ether, right? Why do I have to go? Why do I have to keep making the same duck à l'orange again? Why can't I try something new, something daring, so I can invent something, or I can travel the world and go to I don't know, China or India, and discover new spices that I want to incorporate into my dishes. So this kind of inventiveness, that was new. That hadn't happened before. And we just take it for granted that a chef might invent something new or find a new combination or a new texture or a new ingredient. So that's one thing. And then beyond that, though, the kind of cultural importance of the chef, where the chef has become now, okay, we see chefs on television, chefs are celebrities. That also didn't really exist. If you think back to the great famous restaurants of the 1950s and 60s, and I'm not that familiar with these restaurants, but like, take Maxim's in Paris, the most famous restaurant in the world. There's no chef that comes to mind about, it's all about the restaurant, the restaurateur. It's not about the chef. That is what also changed in this period in the 1970s, where suddenly the chefs were the main characters. The chefs were also the owners. Paul Bocuse was very, very proud of the fact that he had kind of led the charge for him and his compatriots. that they were now no longer employees. They were the owners of their own shops. They were the owners of their own restaurants. And that's another sort of a cultural shift that took place in this 1970s period. Um, and then, of course, the just to take one more example, the kind of popular culture, media culture surrounding food and restaurants and chefs also has its origins in this time. Before the Nouvelle Cuisine period, in you had the Michelin Guide, which was, which was sort of this a very authoritative but very dry compilation of restaurants and addresses, with some of them being given stars to recommend them. But there was no writing, there was no critique, there was no voice there in the Michelin Guide, and it was Go and Mio who, again, this is post 1960s new journalism. They put themselves into the stories. They write narratives about going to the Trois Gras restaurant and working in the kitchen for a week and what was that like and other things like that. And they launched a very successful magazine, Go and Mio, in the early 1970s. So this idea, this entire discourse around food, the food culture, the food magazine, chefs going on television, chefs, Paul Bocuse on the cover of Newsweek magazine. It said all of this kind of happens in the 70s. And again, today we live with the after effects of that huge shift in the culture where suddenly food and restaurants and chefs are part of the popular culture.
You sort of transitioned into my next question was, well, Nouvelle may be technically dead and people don't know what it is. The offshoot is, I guess, what we call fusion cuisine now, where you do have this sort of mixture of chef from here taking foods from here and there,
Right. That
working
was
somewhere
exactly
else.
that the kind of opening the there was an exploding interest in this period in the 1970s in food from other places, and taking it seriously. And suddenly there was, a best-selling cookbook in the 1970s telling you how to make authentic Mexican cuisine, telling you how to do Indian cuisine. So there was all this interest in different cuisines, and then chefs were also traveling, and yes, there was the idea of fusion. Um, that sort of happened in the 1980s. And then subsequently, I mean, you can think back to more recently the whole idea of, I guess we're calling it modernist cooking now. I'm not entirely sure about the terminology, but Ferran Adria, El Bulli, um, Elena Arzak in San Sebastian, these restaurants where they were really pushing the limits on technology. Suddenly, everyone everywhere, you went to a restaurant and there were at a fancy restaurant there was foam, or there was kind of strange new inventions. I mean, I've eaten at a few of these places, and it really is kind of like shockingly entertaining, the kind of thing you want to do once, maybe not all the time. And of course, there was also a huge backlash eventually against all that kind of stuff. But certainly the fusion and the modernist cooking, and even today, I would argue if you go to a Michelin three-star restaurant, if you go to Thomas Keller per se in New York, or if you go to Guy Savoy in Paris, a top restaurant, you're going to find all kinds of things that seem like it's not directly nouvelle cuisine, but it's new textures that you haven't tasted, new ingredients that are surprising, new combinations, trademark dishes presented in a kind of almost graphic, beautiful presentation. We haven't even mentioned the presentation, but that was also one of the cliches of nouvelle cuisine was the plates were enormous, and it was like a piece of art you were presented with that you then had to eat. And that's all that that lives on today. If you go to a great restaurant, they put a lot of thought into the presentation, almost the graphic design of how the dish is presented. Even more so today with social media and Instagram and people designing dishes that are perfect for Instagram. You could argue that also, there's an offshoot of this nouvelle cuisine kind of revolution that happened.
What do you consider to be some of the big secrets of French cuisine?
I guess I thought of it on two levels. One is, as we've already discussed, I think nouvelle cuisine was a sort of seminal moment, a crucial period in culinary history that has been overlooked. And the reason it's been overlooked is because it was hugely popular, hugely influential, and then it died a very, very quick, sudden death where there was an enormous backlash. There was all this terrible Nouvelle Cuisine food. Already in the late 1970s, it was spreading everywhere. Everyone was doing the same, copying the famous Nouvelle Cuisine dishes, but copying them badly. Um, slicing up kiwi fruits and sticking it on top of a chicken and serving tiny portions of undercooked vegetables and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of bad Nouvelle Cuisine that happened in the late 1970s to an enormous backlash. And so as a result, people don't really know about this trend, this cultural shift that happened in the 70s. So that's the first secret. The second secret, though, is as I started my research, I found, okay, I had this cast of characters. I had, Michel Girard, the young, brilliant genius, Paul Bocuse, the kind of godfather figure, the center, the charismatic leader, the Trois Gras brothers, and others. The Band à Bocuse, they called themselves. They were like, they were all friends. They all knew each other. They all traded gossip. They all helped each other out. Paul Bocuse was a terrific, sort of charismatic, a charmer, a flirt, a joker, and also like a kind of ridiculous comedic male chauvinist who thought that, and he had multiple mistresses and multiple children with different women, and he talked about women in the way that's like, a kind of a cliche of how a male chauvinist in the 1950s would talk about women. And he did not think women could be good cooks or, could be inventive chefs. And as I was doing my research, I found there was a group of women chefs, the same generation, who were opening restaurants in the late 60s, early 70s, and who found themselves entirely excluded from the culinary establishment. And so they started their own association, a chefs association for women chefs. This was Annie Devine and Simone Lemaire primarily, and many others who decided to band together and promote women's restaurants. Because they were constantly being attacked by Paul Bocuse, and they were not allowed to join the chef organizations, and so they sort of created their own group. And as I was doing my research, I tracked down these women and went and interviewed them. And to me, that's a sort of a slice of history that's unknown, underknown. I mean, it's not a secret per se, but most people have never heard of the ARC or of Simone Lemaire or Annie Devine or any of these people. So that's another sort of element of the story that is less known. And then connected to that is my villain. We haven't mentioned my villain yet. I have a great villain in this story. Not that I set out to have. I don't have to have a villain when I write a book, but it's helpful to have a nemesis. And in this case, the most powerful food critic in France was Robert Courtine of Le Monde. He'd been the restaurant critic there since the early 1950s, and he hated Nouvelle Cuisine. So he was the mortal enemy of the Band à Bocuse, and of this new faddish cooking, which he thought was ridiculous. He thought that French food should be traditional from the land, and he latched onto these women chefs and decided, oh, these are the women who are going, who are fighting the battle against Nouvelle Cuisine, even though this wasn't quite true because some of the women were doing Nouvelle Cuisine or doing inventive things in their kitchens. But from his perspective, the women were the traditional French housewife, cook, bourgeois cooking, and the men were doing this kind of faddish, fussy cooking that he didn't like. So he inserted himself into the argument about the future of French cooking, and argued that Nouvelle Cuisine was a mistake, and that these women chefs were the future. And of course, he was secretly a Nazi. I'm giving away a little bit of the book, but he had a terrible, dark history. And I don't just mean like he was a collaborator. There were a lot of collaborators during the war, but he was truly a vicious, true believer. And no one knew this, although the gossip started to sort of, trickle out in the 1970s. So that's another sort of secret history about that's sort of embedded in this story.
Yeah, it's a secret that see why you wouldn't want to get out. Now you mentioned Bocuse and Gerard and Trois Gros. Now Gerard wasn't part of this group, but a lot of these guys, six or seven of them, they all trained under one chef, and I've always found that interesting. They all were disciples of Fernand Point.
Yeah, well, certainly Bocuse was, and I think Pierre Troisgros was, and there was a lot of complicated overlaps in the 1950s because they were in the case of Bocuse and Troisgros, their families had restaurants. The Bocuse, his restaurant in Lyon was a family restaurant that he eventually took over, but his parents, he was kind of he born into this restaurant family, and so he was sent off to do apprenticeships around Lyon and eventually, yeah, with La Pyramide and with Le Point. And the same was true of the Troisgros brothers, who were also part of a restaurant family. Their father was the ran the restaurant. He wasn't a chef, but he ran the restaurant, and his two sons were trained as chefs, and they would go and do apprenticeships at different restaurants, yeah, and also at Point. So there was this and Bocuse always makes the argument that it was Point who taught him to not overcook his string beans. For example, this is the famous example of Nouvelle Cuisine fame. They did not overcook their vegetables because there was a it was quite common to go to a restaurant and find kind of mushy beans, mushy vegetables. Nouvelle Cuisine was always undercooking everything. This was a problem later on, by the way, when it became so trendy to undercook vegetables that Julia Child wrote in an article where she's traveling around France and being fed like basically raw beans, decided this is not for me. I'm not a rabbit. So yeah, Point is credited by Bocuse for the one who perfected, who taught them this is exactly how long you cook the green beans so it stays bright green and it still has a little bit of a bite to it, and you can taste the bean, how it's meant to be, how it's meant to taste. The purity of the ingredients, right? This is one of the ideas behind Nouvelle Cuisine, was that traditional French cooking was heavy. Traditional French cooking covered everything with a sauce. Maybe the fish wasn't all that fresh, but it didn't matter because there was this heavy flour enriched thick sauce on top of the fish. And Nouvelle Cuisine rebelled against that. It rebelled against the heaviness. It rebelled against the sauces. And so that instead of, so just to take an example, the famous Troisgros salmon with sorrel sauce, which is the quintessential Nouvelle Cuisine dish, is an interesting case study because, first of all, it wasn't that salmon was new, but instead of cutting the salmon into a steak, they cut it into an escalope along the length of the fish, creating a very, very thin, large piece of salmon, which they then flattened gently. So it was very thin and large. And then they cooked very, very quickly in a non-stick pan, 20 seconds per side, so that it was still rare in the middle. Now that was revolution. That was not that was new in the 1960s and 70s. And then they, instead of covering the fish with the sauce, they made a reduction, a very simple sorrel sauce, and put that on the plate and put the fish on top of the sauce. So the fish is not covered by the sauce. The fish is on top of the sauce. And it's presented on a very large plate because it's such a large, thin piece of salmon that it needed an extra large plate. So this idea of this beautiful, this graphically presented salmon on a very large plate, not covered with sauce, but over the sauce, and prepared on a Teflon pan, which is a new technology, cooked rare, which has never been done, cut in a new way for fish. All of those things made this the quintessential Nouvelle Cuisine dish. And you can see, it's a subtle thing, but and then that dish became so popular. Everybody who came to that restaurant had to order the salmon with sorrel sauce. It's funny when I was there. There's a whole history of the Troisgros restaurant after Nouvelle Cuisine, but eventually Pierre Troisgros's son Michel took over the kitchen in the 1980s, and he decided, like, I'm tired of this salmon with sorrel sauce, this famous dish that has made us so much money and has been so important for the restaurant. I'm going to be my own man, and I'm going to take it off the menu. And so he did, and I'm not sure if it's on the menu or off the menu at this point, but when I was there, he did prepare me the salmon with sorrel sauce, and it was great. So you can still get it if you ask for it. Of course, I'm sure it's changed so much in recent years, but now they have this beautiful little hotel and the restaurant. And I was there interviewing Michelle. Pierre was not there, but then, and I was hoping to interview Pierre, but they want. I sort of so I first I did the interview, and then eventually they said yes, okay. Michelle called up Pierre. Okay, you can go visit him tomorrow morning for breakfast. And so then I drove to his house the next day, and he served us, like some apricot jam and little pieces, and it was great. I took a photo. He at some point in the interview, he showed me his copy of the classic Escoffier cookbook, and he showed it to me. I took a snapshot of that. Anyway, he was great. Wonderful character. And yeah, there was I have to say, the research for this book was fantastic. It was such a wonderful trip. My French is also poor, but I hired a research assistant and slash translator to sort of travel around for me. So that saved me because I feel like I have school French that I learned when I was a kid in Switzerland, and my French is like good enough to follow along a conversation, but then all of the important words I don't know. So I feel like whenever anyone says something boring, I get it. But when someone says something interesting, I'm missing the point. So, that's the level of my French.
I was always thinking, because we keep talking about Bocuse, I've had the pleasure of meeting him and spending time with him. And I think in a lot of ways he took on that role of being the spokesman for French food, and he took on the affectations of the chef. Because certainly when spoke to him privately, he said, very charming, very curious, very just generally a different person.
Yeah.
But that public image of being out there, did he become the spokesman for Nouvelle? He was the figurehead.
It was not only the thing is like he became the sort of ambassador of French culinary, beyond Nouvelle cuisine. He was the most famous chef in the world. And he represented France. And yes, of course, he was associated with Nouvelle Cuisine mainly just because of his age, and that was that what made them all sort of famous. But if you think back to what you eat when you go to Bocuse, it's not very Nouvelle Cuisine, and it never really was. I mean, he was the least interested in experimenting in the kitchen, or at Trois Gros, they were experimenting with sous vide all the way back in the 1970s. They were, like I said, inventing this salmon dish, and Michel Girard was also doing all kinds of, he was eventually working for Nestle, doing a side gig in trying to figure out how frozen food works, and also inventing new dishes based on his travels in China or whatever. Bocuse was the least inventive of these people, but he was the most charismatic, let's just say. He was the star. He was also the first of this group to get his third Michelin star and to sort of, become one of the most famous in France. Um, and then yeah, he was traveling the world and opening up restaurants in other places and consulting with airlines, and you know he was the impresario. So yeah, he sort of led the way in figuring out how to be a celebrity chef, right? He was kind of the first one to do it in the modern world, the first one to be on the cover of magazines and to appear on television and to get the Legion of Honor award and all the other things that happened. Um, and I think that was down to I never he died before I started this book, but my impression is that it was his personality. He was just that he had the force of will and the charisma that was well suited to taking on that role. Um, and and he was also generous. I said earlier how he was sort of a male chauvinist, and I'd rather have a woman in my bed than behind the stove, and I want my women to smell like Chanel, not like goose fat or whatever. These kinds of quotes about women and the male chauvinism. But he was truly a wonderfully generous figure who, whenever he was getting involved, like, okay, he gets hired by Air France to be involved in designing the menu for the new 747 jet, flights. And he brings in Roger Verger, and he brings in all of his friends to help design the menu. He's always bringing people in on these deals. Because that's the kind, it was the band double goose. They were all in it together.
I think ambassador was the word I was looking for, and certainly he was very generous with his time and
Right,
his knowledge, which I think is often overlooked by people who didn't have to deal with him or associate with him.
right, right.
Uh,
That's the other. I mean, I didn't put too much of this in. I heard so many funny stories about his various pranks, um, and all very elaborate, very long. Planning long in advance. Where for example, he takes people on a picnic, and then he sets up the picnic, and then he brings the basket, and he says, "Oh my, I only have this can of dog food here. That's the only food I have, but it'll be fine." And then he opens up this can of dog food, which has a label on it saying that it's dog food, and in fact, it's foie gras. And then he serves it, and it's all for the moment of the sort of shock and then the reveal. Anyway, so he was an amusing character, that's for sure.
I think you could probably make the argument that Michel Gerard was into Nouvelle, but he didn't start out that way. He started off for health reasons. He wanted to create a healthy cuisine, which sort of fit into the Nouvelle
Yeah,
movement.
I don't know if that's I don't think that I think it started with him wanting to the anecdote that he told me, which is in the book, is he's working at the Lido, this nightclub in Paris in the 1960s, and he's trained as a dessert. He's doing elaborate cakes. I think he won the MOF award for patisserie. And but then he's hired by Clerico, who's the owner of this nightclub, to come to his weekend estate, which is this very, very grand mansion on the outskirts of Paris near Versailles, and this is in the 1960s, and he's hosting this dinner party, sort of a 1960s dinner party with bohemian artists and filmmakers, and I'm not sure exactly who was there, but and then he tells Michel Gerard, just cook whatever you want. Cook something, you know, eh, cook whatever you like. You don't have to do the classics. You don't have to. And Michel took the opportunity to design a new dish involving chicken breasts and cucumbers and a little bit of cream and a little bit of vermouth. And this moment of invention that felt very much, of the moment in the 1960s, that's what he wanted to capture when he launched his own restaurant, the Pot au Feu. Um, but yes, he then he ends up losing that restaurant because of the road is being widened. The bureaucrats in Paris have decided to change this whole neighborhood around, and so his restaurant is being torn down, and he ends up moving to um, the southwest of France and opening a new restaurant, Le Pré du Génie, where he then decides to develop a kind of a diet cuisine, which is incredibly popular, turns into this massive best-selling cookbook called Slimming Cuisine. And yes, there is because there's always was an element of nouvelle cuisine. We mentioned earlier about how it was lighter, right? You've dispensed with these rich sauces and you dispense with long cooking stews, and instead everything is cooked very fresh and everything is seasonal. So there's an element there already you can see that fits in with, oh, this is a kind of healthy, also think about it in the 1970s, health food is au courant, right? So this Michel Gerard, who explicitly makes it into a kind of health food, diet food, is incredibly popular, and gets intertwined with the history of Nouvelle Cuisine for sure, because a lot of people think of Nouvelle Cuisine as a kind of a healthy a style of cooking.
I think it's interesting is that I think that how this movement, Nouvelle, is largely forgotten and swept under the rug, so to speak. But yet, the way we eat today is, well, I don't know. 90% influenced by
I
that
think
movement?
so. I mean, that's my premise. That's the argument I'm making. Of course, the food world, the restaurant world is so vast. You can find, you can find evidence for, I guess, any theory about how it evolved. But I think some of the core ideas, you know, the inventiveness, the celebration of invention, the idea of the chef as a kind of creative figure, um, the chef as an auteur, that's something that didn't exist before Nouvelle Cuisine and certainly still exists today. And then, the idea of a restaurant having a kind of excitement, a new chef, a new restaurant. I describe in my book when Michel Gerard opens Le Pot au Feu, in Agnières, on the outskirts of Paris, in a kind of bad neighborhood, and people are trekking out because this restaurant is suddenly getting attention in the newspapers, and people are trekking out to this far-flung neighborhood, and where this kind of an industrial neighborhood. It's, to me, it has all the echoes of, like, oh, a hot new restaurant in Bushwick in Brooklyn, and there's a new chef doing something, and you go out there. That whole culture of kind of the sex appeal of the restaurant doesn't have to be fancy. It's just sort of new and exciting. That also goes back to Nouvelle Cuisine. And then, the sort of theatricality of so much food, especially at the high end. It doesn't have to be foam or pop rocks that taste like artichokes or whatever crazy thing you can imagine someone invented, which exists. But nevertheless, the kind of theater of the restaurant, the theater of the plate, the design of the plate, caring about that also in a way has its origins in Nouvelle Cuisine. So there's a lot that you can see. And then, of course, like we were saying, the idea of fusion, the idea of finding ingredients or influences from other cultures and other cuisines, that's very much alive and thriving. So all of these things go back to that, you know, 1970s period.
I think you could even make an argument that this farm to table movement can trace its roots to Nouvelle as well.
Right, right. The sort of the absolute, the commandment to have the freshest ingredients, the most seasonal ingredients, to respect the purity of the ingredients. Certainly, you can see some of that in whatever, in Alice Waters, or in other, other. That's also happening in the 70s concurrently. So it's certainly part of the conversation there. Yeah.
Maybe I have to ask, wrap it up, and I'll say, so what's next for you?
What's next for me is, I'm leaving France behind, at least temporarily, and I'm writing about sushi.
Oh,
It's a book about sushi in the 1980s, and when sushi kind of broke through into the broader culture in the United States. And yeah, that's I've always wanted to write about Japan. My wife is Japanese, and I've been going there since the early 90s, my whole life, my whole adult life, basically. So, and I've always wanted to write about Japan, Japanese culture, and then especially here in the States, and how it kind of, came with via, Nobu and Masa and so forth, in the 1980s.
talk about how the salmon roll came originated in Norway or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like I said, I'm sushi. There's a whole funny and fascinating story of how there's some sort of impresarios, importer, exporter type people in the 1960s who were like, we gotta bring, and they who brought sushi over into LA, basically, and like, we're furnishing restaurants in Little Tokyo in LA with everything you needed to set up a sushi counter. Like, you need this kind of wasabi, and you need this kind of nori, or whatever, all the ingredients. And also frozen fish started coming over. And there's a whole fascinating story of how people figured out how to transport very, very fresh fish on 747s, in the 70s. So that's all the backstory. Sushi was already happening in LA in the 60s and 70s. And that's kind of interesting, and it'll be in this book. But to me, the real story that I'm interested in is in the 1980s, when it kind of really explodes into the popular culture, and which is when it goes beyond being a kind of ethnic cooking, and it becomes bigger than that. And that's coincidental. That's right exactly at the same time that the Japanese bubble economy is at its peak and then it collapses. And you have people like Donald Trump taking out a full-page ad in the New York Times in 1987, decrying the goddamn Japanese. They don't pay their share. We need to put tariffs on the Japanese. Michael Crichton's Rising Sun book, and then there's a movie. There's a huge backlash against Japanese culture and all the, some Japanese company had bought Rockefeller Center. This is in the 1980s, or they bought Columbia Pictures. So there's a kind of a political backstory that I find fascinating happening at the same time. So that's my new book.
Sounds interesting because I know there's a lot of interesting stories about particular roles, like the California role and this role and that role and different.
Yeah, there's a whole, no one knows who invented the California roll, supposedly. There's multiple people that claim they did. So there's some amusing stories there for sure.
It's like Poutine in Quebec. There's a bunch of places that started it.
Right.
Well, that sounds great. Well, Luke, thank you again. I really enjoyed this conversation, and best of luck with with this book and your forthcoming projects.
Yeah, thank you very much. You too.
Our thanks once again to Luke Barr for taking the time to talk to us about his new book, The Secret History of French Cooking, The Outlaw Chefs Who Made Food Modern. I'm James Reford, and this has been Books About Food, the podcast. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.